chamo ao palco agora Antônia Talarida, ex-presidente do IFL, diretora de estratégia e campanhas na organização Morada Comum. Antônia. Bjorn Lomborg, cientista político e estatístico dinamarquês, autor best-seller e presidente do Copenhagen Consensus Center. Bjorn. Salva de palmas também ao Bjorn. Antônia, eu vou deixar a abertura então desse painel com você, Antônia. É contigo. Toca daí.
Muito obrigada, Paula. Boa tarde a todos. Eu tenho minhas anotações aqui, porque eu vou ter que fazer essa mediação em inglês. Então, peço desculpas, eu anotei aqui para não dar nenhum vexame. Well, Bjorn, everywhere we look today.
I'm happy. I thought this was all going to be in Portuguese.
No, gotcha. So, everywhere we look today, on social media, on the news, in politics, we hear that we're living through a climate emergency. So the narrative is often one of alarm, rising temperatures, devastating consequences, and even the suggestion of an approaching end. And it makes me wonder, and perhaps many of you that are listening to us, is this really an emergency we are told it is? Are we being too skeptical, like risking the future of our children, of my grandchildren? Or is this alarmism a narrative shaped by institutions to seek influence or even money? Or perhaps is there a middle ground between those two scenarios? So with these questions, I would like to hand you the microphone for you to present to us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a perfect question to launch into my PowerPoint slides. So I'm an academic. I like to believe in data. I like to believe in thinking about smart ways to project real data into the conversation. So I'd like to, if it's okay with you and if it's okay with you guys, just simply to give you a few pointers of what I think we need to have if we're going to have a good conversation on climate change. So yes, we are vastly exaggerating climate change. So 60% of all people now in the rich world believe that climate change, unmitigated climate change, will likely or very likely end mankind. It's actually 63% in Brazil. That's just simply ridiculous. That's not what is reality. It's not what the science says. It's certainly not what the UN climate panel, the so-called IPCC, says. Climate change is a problem. It's absolutely happening. It's real. It's man-made, but it's often also very exaggerated. Again, I just have 20 minutes. I'm just going to do this very quick. I'm just going to give you one idea, but I'm sure we can talk about more later on. Let's just take one of these things that you hear all the time, this idea of wildfire, that the world is burning up. New York Times a couple of years ago had a whole series of articles that were headlined, "A World on Fire." We believe that the world is on fire. This is just not what the numbers is telling us. Let's take a look at this, because we do have good evidence, at least since 1900. How much of the planet used to burn every year? The answer was, in 1900 until about 2000, it went down from about 4.2% now down to almost 3%. This is a historical reconstruction. Obviously, we didn't have satellites, so this is the best we can know. But what it does tell us is this is the inputs that they use for their own climate models. This is the best that we know. But since then, of course, we have satellites. We have NASA satellites circling the Earth 24/7, measuring all the fire that goes on. And this is the satellite data. Not increasing, dramatically decreasing, about 25%. If you notice, the 2025 is not done yet. This is till September 2. But what it tells us is it is very likely that currently we're on track to get the lowest burn ever. It is not such that the world is burning more and more. It's actually burning less and less. And if we look into the future, we also estimate, even if we do no climate policy, the world will burn less. If we do very strong climate policy, it'll burn even less. So yes, climate change does make a sense. Climate change policy can make sense, but it's not because we should be panicked that the world is burning up. Why is this happening? This is because most people don't want fire. And so obviously, they very clearly and consciously say, we want to make sure there's less fire. This is because mankind knows how to prevent or how to adapt. This is what we do, and we've done that in many different ways. So when you hear the world is on fire, no, it's less and less on fire, and we need to know. So why do we get it so wrong on climate? I would argue it's because we miss adaptation. We miss the fact that most people adapt. If you listen to the media, you will get the sense that there's more and more extreme weather and that it's killing indiscriminately. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at what happens when we measure the number of climate-related deaths, possibly the best measure to go back in time and say how many people die from floods, drought, storms, and wildfires. We have pretty good data for at least 100 years. And 100 years ago, the average number of people dying each year over a decade, again, remember, it fluctuates a lot, so averaged over a decade, used to be almost 500,000 people. 500,000 people used to die each and every year from floods, drought, storms, and wildfires. Since then, you would imagine if you listen to the media that it's gone up. You would be very, very wrong. It's actually gone dramatically down. So that today, less than 10,000 people die each and every year. And of course, remember, at the same time, we've quadrupled the global population. What does this tell us? Again, this has nothing to do with climate, but everything to do with the fact that we as human beings are better able to adapt because we have more technology, because we're richer, and because we know much more, we have much better projections and all these things. Yes, there may be a climate signal below, but human ingenuity vastly outnumbers the problems that climate change projects. So what that again tells us is we need to realize we've been told this end of the world story, but in reality, climate change is a problem. Sorry, let me just jump over this. Climate change is not the end of the world, it's a problem. And it's a problem that actually gets better and better, but slightly slower because of climate change. Let me show you what that means. And this is, of course, also one of the reasons why this whole conversation is so difficult. It's easy to shout, oh my God, the end is coming. It's much harder to tell you what is the right answer, namely, yes, there is a tiny problem, but it's not the end of the world. Look at hunger deaths. A lot of people worry about climate change will undercut our ability to feed mankind. We have dramatically lowered hunger deaths over the last, 31 years. From 1990, we used to have 6.5 million kids under 5 dying each year from hunger. Today, that number is near 2.3 million. So still terrible, but much, much better. It's sloping downwards. The World Health Organization then tried to estimate what would happen with hunger if there was no climate change. This is what they found. So we'll still see less and less hunger. But then they said, what will happen if we have climate change? What will happen if we don't do very much about climate change? This is what they found, that you will get almost the same. But you will get a little more hunger deaths, or the progress will be postponed for a few years by 2050. What this very clearly shows us is the fundamental point is, even with climate change, the world is still going to be much, much better in 2050. Many fewer kids are going to die from hunger, but slightly more fewer kids are going to die, right? Yes, it's a problem. No, it's not the end of the world, and we need to address it that way. That, of course, is why climate economists have spent the last 3 decades trying to estimate when we take a look across all of these things. Because remember, I've just shown you a few bits. I've shown you wildfire, I've shown you hunger, but there's many, many other things out there that are going to be the impacts of climate change. But what climate economists have tried to do is to say, when we look across everything in the whole world, so sea level rise and storms, but also, of course, heat and cold and so on, what will be the total impact on human life. This is their answer. So two of the most prominent people in the climate economics community, one of them is William Nordhaus, the only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize in economics, and Richard Tol, the other one of the most quoted climate economists. They both made meta-studies, that is, take all the knowledge that we have and said, what will be the impact? This is what Richard Tol found. What that shows here is, if you look global warming, the warmer it gets out the x-axis, and what's the impact measured in percent of GDP. And as you can see, the warmer it gets, the worse it gets. But what is also important is, this is not anywhere close to the end of the world. If you look at what's likely to happen by the end of the century, so about 3 degrees centigrade, it's about 1.9%. That's what Richard Tol found. A 3-degree temperature increase will be the equivalent of the world losing 1.9% of its GDP each and every year. Nordhaus does these numbers slightly different, so he comes up with a slightly higher number. I'm not going to show you the same graph, but fundamentally the same thing, a 3.1. So climate change, roughly, is a 2 to 3% problem. It's not 100%, it's not nowhere close to 100%, but it is a real problem. It will feel like we will be 2 to 3% less well off by the end of the century than we otherwise would. But it is perhaps also important to have a sense of proportion. The UN estimates that by the end of the century, the average person on the planet will be about 4.5 times as rich, so 450% as rich, as he or she is today. This is the standard scenario. This is the middle of the road. This is not hugely optimistic. It's not hugely pessimistic. We will be much, much better off. This is a fantastic outcome of the world. But remember, because of global warming, it's going to feel like we're 2 to 3% less well off. So we're not going to be 450% as rich. In fact, we'll only be 435 to 440% as rich. It's important to point out that, yes, this is a problem. It'd be better if we were at 450. But it's also incredibly important to keep remembering this is still a pretty damn good world, even if we're only 435% as well off. That's the main point that we need to take away from climate. It's a problem, it's not the end of the world. So the problem with the way that we're tackling it right now, and I think that's also very true in Brazil, but I'm sure that's what we're going to be talking about in just a bit, is that most of our climate policies are incredibly unrealistic and unsustainable because they're simply too expensive, and yet they do almost nothing to fix climate change. So a lot of people will tell you, oh, solar and wind is the answer, because solar and wind is some of the cheapest electricity you can possibly get. What they forget, or what they often don't tell you, of course, is, yes, solar is the cheapest you can get in many places, at least, certainly here in Brazil, but only when the sun is shining. Most of us want power 24/7. It's the same thing with wind. When the wind is not blowing, it's infinitely expensive. So the reality is very often you just simply have to buy 2 electricity systems. You both have to have solar and wind, and then you have to have the full backup system for when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. That turns out to be much more expensive. Now, there's been lots of academic conversations forth and back about what's the actual cost of solar and wind. But there's a very simple way that we can see what the world actually does. I've taken all the nations that we know and taken a look at how much of their electricity do they get from solar and wind. That's out the x-axis. And then I plotted it against the actual cost of a kilowatt hour. This is both for households and for industry. Remember, most countries around the world make electricity for industry much cheaper than for households. If you just plot this, we get a real-world answer to whether solar and wind is really cheaper. These are the 71 countries that we have good data for from 2023. I've marked out some of the numbers here. You can also see Brazil there. What this basically shows us is that there are no countries with lots of solar and wind and cheap electricity. There are lots of countries with much solar and wind and very high prices. It is just empirically wrong to argue that solar and wind is incredibly cheap, because fundamentally what we see is the backup cost, the fact that you need much more transmission, you need a lot of other cost on the back end of getting power 24/7, means you end up with much, much higher costs. This is really what we just have to look at to say, all right, we're being sold something that's very costly. This, of course, is also why you have to keep pushing through policies to get solar and wind. Now, if it was saving the world, maybe it'd be worth it. But it's not about saving the world. It's about saving a part of a 2 to 3% problem. And then, of course, we need to ask the simple question, how much does that cost? Because, and this is what climate economics really brings to the table, I think. Climate economics over the last 30 years have made this very, very simple point. Yes, climate has real and costly damages. This is what everyone has heard. This is what everyone knows. But it's also true that climate policy means costly damages. Given that we have to pay both of those costs, we should really find a way to minimize the sum of those two. That's essentially what William Nordhaus got his Nobel Prize for, and that is what I'm going to show you right now. Because remember, almost all countries, and certainly Brazil, but also my native country, Denmark, and pretty much every other big, rich, liberal country in the world have promised to go net zero by 2050. Isn't it curious that nobody's ever done a cost-benefit analysis on net zero? It's a little surprising because it turns out this is very arguably not only a very expensive policy, but it's probably the most expensive policy any politician in the world has ever promised, and by a far margin. The second costliest policy in the world was probably the Versailles Treaty in 1919, which cost about $500 billion. This will cost in the order of 1,000 to 2,000 times more. So maybe we should get it right. So what is the cost and what is the benefit of net zero? Well, Robert Mendelsohn at Yale University gathered some of the world's top climate economists in 2023 and asked them that exact question. They put out a full edition of Climate Change Economics, a period journal, to investigate this. Most of the economists actually chickened out, but we ended up with one estimate of the benefit and 3 estimates of the costs. This is not perfect. I would certainly love to have better numbers, but these are the only numbers that we have right now. So what I'm going to show you is the numbers that all of our politicians should have had in front of them before they promised net zero. So what they found was there are real annual benefits to do net zero. We reduce climate damages that have real benefits. They estimate the average annual undiscounted benefits of net zero is $4.5 trillion each and every year in the 21st century. That's a lot of money. That is a real argument for doing something about climate. But what they also showed was the cost of doing this is going to be phenomenally much larger. It's going to be around $27 trillion. So spending $27 trillion each and every year to achieve benefits 1/7 of that, about $4.5 trillion, is a really bad deal. This is what the world is doing right now. And that's why I think we need to have a smarter and a better conversation. So I'm going to wrap this up in 2 slides, and I was allowed to spend another 5 minutes to just talk a little bit more about some of the other stuff that I do. But fundamentally, what should we do? Well, first of all, we should tell it as it is. Global warming is a real problem, but it's not the end of the world. This is not only good because it's true, but of course it's also good because it can stop a lot of people worrying endlessly about the end of the world. This is not what is going to cause the end of the world. There may be other things we should talk about, but climate is not one of them. We should also think about what's the only realistic solution. So my think tank worked with 50 of the world's top climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, to try and find out what is the best way to spend reais or dollars or whatever your currency is to do the most good for climate. What they found was this is all about innovation. The only way we're going to fix this problem is to invest a lot more in low carbon and research and development. Imagine if we could invest and deliver fourth generation nuclear. The idea is fourth generation nuclear is just going to be incredibly cheap and basically deliver CO2-free energy. If we could do that, we wouldn't have to have the next COP here in Brazil or anything else. We wouldn't have to twist anyone's arms to promise all kinds of climate policies. People would just switch because it was cheaper. If we can innovate green energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone will switch and we'll be done. This is a much cheaper way to deal with it than actually trying to do what we're currently doing, namely just subsidizing lots of costly and inefficient solutions like putting up thousands of wind turbines. Then we should also adapt. This is what humanity has done since the Babylonians, and we should certainly keep doing that, and we should make it easier for a lot of people to do that. We know that that can avoid a large part of the climate problem. And then lastly, we should also make sure we boost economic growth. Because remember, there's a reason why economic growth is good. Of course, it's good for all kinds of other reasons, but it also leaves poor people much less vulnerable. If a hurricane hits Florida, sure, a few people die, and then Florida moves on. If the same sort of hurricane hits Guatemala, it's game over. It's a dramatic cost to the economy for years. It'll cost tens of thousands of lives. So getting people out of poverty is not only good for all kinds of other reasons, it's also good because it'll actually reduce climate vulnerability. And so this is really how we need to think about what is it that we should be doing about climate. But, and I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on what is it that we should think about all the other problems. Remember, everybody talks about climate like it was the big issue of the world. But if you look around the world, there are tons of other problems. Hunger, disease, lack of jobs, obviously bad education. There are many, many other issues, and all of these needs solutions. Currently, we're spending about $2 trillion on climate. That's 2% of global GDP. That's a lot of money. If we could do that more efficiently, then we would have a lot of other money left over to do better. And that's really what my think tank, the Copenhagen Consensus, we work with hundreds of the world's top economists, 7 Nobel laureates in economics, to try and find out where can you do the most good. And one of the things we're very excited about is to also do this conversation, have this discussion in Brazil about what should you be doing. Let me just give you one example, and then I'll shut up. Let me talk about education. So very clearly, education is a huge issue. So notice I've just totally walked away from climate. I want to talk about climate again, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but there are many other issues. Take education. Everybody agrees education is a big problem, something that we should do something about. We're not learning enough, we're not making our kids productive enough. How do you do that? Well, in Brazil, there are many, many bad policies. One bad policy is one that is instituted on the federal level in Brazil, namely that you each year have to spend more than R$1 billion on basically school furniture. Think about that. I mean, all the kids have new, nice desks. That's cool. Is desks going to improve learning? No. They don't do that anywhere. We have lots of evidence to show this is not an effective policy for education. In fact, it's a zero impact policy. We spend lots of money and get no benefits for it. There are other incredibly smart policies in education that we don't embrace. Just to give you one example, one of the bigger problems in any classroom is take a classroom of 30 kids. They're all over the place, right? Some of these kids are really smart and way ahead of the teachers. Some of them have very little sense of what's going on and struggling. But if there's only one teacher, you have to sort of teach somewhere in the middle, and you leave out the kids who are far ahead and the kids who are far behind. You can't do it any other way. But what if you could? Well, it turns out the evidence shows we have a very, very much better way to tackle this. It's called teaching at the right level. One way to do that is by teaching each kid at his or her own level, is to put each kid in front of a tablet with educational software 1 hour a day. If you do that, that 1 hour, the kid will learn much more because the tablet will very quickly pick up on where you are and start at that level and teach you at your speed. Now, so all the kids can still be in the same class, you'll have 30 tablets, but they'll learn at different levels, but they will all learn at their optimal level. If you do that, it'll cost about $31 per kid per year, so not nothing, but very little compared to most of the costs that we've already sunk into schools. But the benefit will be, you'll go to school every day, you'll go to 7 hours of still boring school, but 1 hour a day, you'll actually learn a lot. If you look at that after 1 year of going to school, it turns out you've learned so much that you learned 3 times what you normally would have done in a normal school. You've just tripled the efficiency of school. We estimate the benefit of every reais spent is somewhere between 50 and 100 reais of future earnings, higher productivity. Again, if you think about what works and what doesn't, not only can we use that in climate, but we can use it across the board and saying, if you want to do better, let's think about what others have already done. Use the best evidence and actually be smart about our policies. That's what we're all about, and that's what I'm hoping the rest of our conversation will be about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. We could go on and on with this lecture.
Oh, can I? No.
But then my outfit wouldn't pay off the cost-benefit relationship. It wouldn't pay off. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I'm dedicated now in an organization that wants to create a conservative environmentalism movement. And one thing that we're reading, Roger Scruton, Green Philosophy, which is great, I recommend. And he talks a lot about the need to engage the common citizen in the environmental debate, which the movement, the traditional environmentalism activists didn't do. So it's always top-down, it's always like those big global organizations, and that's why I think it failed. But what you're describing today is that the dominant narrative is so alarmist that often the people either look away because they don't want to see, because they shut it down, or they feel trapped in this no solution scenario. So given this need to engage the common citizen, but how the narrative was shaped, is being shaped nowadays, how do you see a conservative environmentalism or a narrative that truly connects with ordinary people, with the ordinary citizen and its values? So I wanted to, we have discussed a little bit on during lunch, and I wanted your opinion on it.
It's a very interesting question. There's a lot of complexity in this. So I think, first of all, there's a top-down concern, that is that we're being pushed this catastrophist narrative on everybody, and I think that makes a lot of kids and frankly adults scared witless. And that's just terrible if it's untrue. If it was true, we should probably be saying it, but it's not. And so we need to stop that. It's also very clear, if you think about what's the world's biggest environmental problem. Most people will talk about water, but many people will talk about climate. It is by far, if you measure it in death, air pollution. Air pollution kills way more people than anything else. And again, remember, you probably are, you guys, I'm assuming most of you guys are middle-class people, so you probably think of air pollution as an outdoor air pollution problem. And that's a big part of it, but it's by no means the only thing. We estimate some 3 million people die from indoor air pollution. So this is basically cooking and keeping warm with dirty fuels inside your house or your hut or wherever you live. This kills a lot of people. We estimate it's probably 1.5 to 2 billion people on the planet who cook and keep warm with these dirty fuels. And for each one of these, it's especially women and kids, it's the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes each day because it's so polluted indoors. If you go to most places, the kind of worst pollution that we see in New Delhi or used to have in Beijing like 5 or 10 years ago, tenfold increase that, and that's what it's like in most indoor places in, for instance, Africa. We need to get a sense of proportion. How do you deal with that? Obviously, indoor air pollution, it's easy. You get people out of poverty. None of you guys, I'm assuming, in here are worried about going into your kitchen, at least not because it's polluted, right? Because you have electricity or you have gas. We need to get the rest of humankind up on that level. And of course, likewise, once we start realizing air pollution is a problem, we clean up our engines. We have much, much cleaner outdoor air in most rich countries around the world. There's a famous graph on London air pollution. And what you basically see is since 1585, what you see here is air pollution just gets worse and worse and worse in London up till about 1890. What happens there is the peak of industrialization and people start getting concerned about it. You also start noticing that pollution is really an unburnt potential. You could have burnt it cleaner and then have gotten more out of your fuel. And so what you see is a decline. And now London is down below the air pollution that it was in 1585. It's never been cleaner in London since the medieval times. Why? Because you're rich and because we have technology. These are the kinds of things that we need to get to people to understand. This is what drives most environmental benefits. Remember, again, you don't cut down forests when you're rich. You have reforestation in most rich countries. You have a lot of deforestation in the Congo, but I mean, nobody wants to have living conditions as in the Congo. We need to get people out of poverty into wealth, and that will, to a very large extent, make most environmental problems better. Not all, you still need some regulation, and we need to be honest about that, but we need to get our priorities right. And I think that's what this conversation can help with.
Yeah, and that's very reassuring because what you're talking about is that we need progress and not degrowth, which is something that we hear a lot in this environmental ecosystem. When you talk about those solutions that have the good cost benefit, they often involve significant investment in technology, in innovation, and from my experience in the public sector, money is not the issue. So we have development banks, we have multilateral organizations, and they have plenty of money just waiting for good projects to be invested in. But at least here in Brazil, we don't see it a lot. We see a lot of startups trying to resolve the issue, but what do you think it's missing? Because if it's not the money, it's the innovation ecosystem, it's the environment for entrepreneurship that might be holding these solutions back a little bit. So in your perspective, what's missing so we can get to really see those costs, the solutions that have a good cost-benefit relation on air?
So first of all, you've just made me want to move to Brazil. Apparently, money is not the problem here. So I'm going to get some of that money. So my understanding is that, yes, there's a lot of money rushing around. As I pointed out, there's we spend more than $2 trillion in climate. Obviously, there's a lot of money, and there's a lot of people who get a lot of the money, and it's spent on really, really bad policies. I think there's two things we need to take away. First, if we focus on smart solutions, we can spend much, much less and actually end up doing much, much more good. Remember, again, when you talk about climate change, a lot of people, I come from Denmark. We're a very, very small country. We fit into a little part of Sao Paulo. And everybody in Denmark, well, a lot of people in Denmark feel very virtuous about having cut their carbon emissions, right? And it has literally no impact on the rest of the world. It's just made us poor, and that was it. but we feel very good about it. So I guess there's that.
Congrats.
Yes, congratulations. But the reality is, climate change is not about getting a few rich or well-meaning people to feel good about themselves. It's presumably about getting everybody off fossil fuels eventually, or off emitting CO2. And the only way we're going to achieve that is through innovation. The beauty of innovation is also it's much, much cheaper. Remember, eggheads or researchers are essentially cheap. You can buy lots and lots of them and still have much money left over. So we estimate we should be spending about $100 billion, so much more than what we're spending today on research and development, but still much, much less, about 5% of what we're spending just today on climate policies, where the vision is to spend even more, $5 or $10 trillion in a decade or two. We can do it much cheaper at much lower cost. My concern is, so with your question, how do we get the ecosystem of startups and all that stuff to get going? I think it's much more a question of saying we need public investment, because you need investment where there's still no private basis for doing so. Remember, economists will tell you there's an underinvestment in basic research and development across the board, because when you do stuff that'll eventually end up being the kind of medical research that Pfizer or someone else will make into real big money, you do it, but you have no idea what it's going to do, and you have no idea how you're going to market it if you even get to that point. And once you get to market it, your patent has run out. This is why you don't get a lot of investment in basic research and development, because you can't recoup most of your money. But it's still a great idea for the public or for the world for this to be done. And that's why we need to make sure that we invest public money. This is why we spend public money on health research. This is also why we should be spending public money on energy research, so low carbon energy research and development. But then, once we find those ideas, once you find out how to do fourth generation nuclear, there's going to be lots of startups that want to do this and that'll take it forward. And we know how to make that happen. We just need the right regulation, which is really not too much regulation, so that we get these sorts of outcomes.
Yeah, perfect. Talking about solutions, so I think it's the good part, the optimist part. Two questions in one. If you could choose just 3 climate-related interventions or solutions that you in those years you like kind of studied and saw that they're the best cost benefit, what would it be? And I've done my research, and I heard you talking about how to kind of reflect sunlight and ideas that are kind of really out of the box, and we don't see much, but they seem interesting and kind of based on science. And so this is one of the 3 solutions that we have now that could work. And also, if you could talk a little bit more on the work you've been doing with Governador Romeu Zema at Minas Gerais as well, just sure. so we can inspire other governors to maybe do the same.
Yes, that would be good. So first of all, again, we found when we asked all the Nobels what are the best ways to tackle climate change, the best long-term solution is to invest a lot more into research and development. We estimate for every dollar spent, you'll do $11 of climate benefits, or you'll avoid $11 of climate damage. So it's a really, really good idea. But as you also pointed out, we actually looked into something called geoengineering. So the idea of saying, is there a way to do much cheaper tackling of climate change? And the answer is yes, there are. Yes, there is, sorry. That fundamentally, if you focus on making the Earth slightly more reflective, essentially put sunglasses on the planet, you could potentially avoid a very large part of global warming at very, very low cost. Just to give you one example, if you look at satellite pictures across the Pacific Ocean, you can actually see where boats have been going, typically diesel-driven boats. They'll have this little contrail, a little bit like what you see from airplanes. And what that is it's the particulates from the diesel engines that go up into the lower atmosphere and help create particulates around which cloud droplets condense, so you end up with getting clouds. The beauty of that is, if you get those clouds, they will reflect sunlight and lower global temperatures. Now, obviously, we don't like the idea of the diesel thing, and it's not very systematic, but what we could do was, for instance, whirl up sea salt into the lower atmosphere, so sea salt particulates, and you'd get the same condensation, and you'd create more white clouds, or you'd make them whiter than they otherwise would be. If you could just make clouds a little bit whiter, you could basically counteract all of global warming. And then you could basically avoid all of global warming. And the amazing thing is, this would cost virtually nothing, so about $10 billion a year. So I don't have that, but it's not a whole lot of money compared to the fact that we're spending $2 trillion on this. So we could get it many orders of magnitude cheaper. Again, we're not saying this is what we should be doing, but we should certainly be investigating it, because it would be a good backup strategy if we really want to fix climate change. Then I think, again, I can't stress enough, if you really want to fix climate change and many, many other problems, it's about getting people out of poverty. Fundamentally, poverty is by far the world's polluter, the world's worst polluter in all kinds of different ways. And it's not just an environmental problem, it's terrible in all kinds of ways. I'm always astounded when I talk to climate warriors or climate campaigners. They will tell you, poor are the most vulnerable to climate change, which is absolutely true. But remember, the poor are the worst and most vulnerable to everything. They're the most vulnerable to health, so diseases or bad education, losing their jobs, all kinds of things. If we can get people out of poverty into wealth, we can do so much better. And so again, we need to remember, it's actually a really great climate policy also to lift people out of poverty. With that said, I'm just going to answer the other part of your question, and then I know I should probably also shut up. But fundamentally, what we try to do is to think about where can you spend an extra dollar or an extra reais and do the most good. Remember, there are lots of experiments out in the world that have already shown what works and what doesn't work. Why don't we use that? Politics, of course, is about a lot of other things apart from just being cost effective. It's a lot of things about doing something for whomever voted you into office or are going to vote you back into office, or all kinds of political backroom deals and all that. But at least getting the knowledge of what really works is useful to getting people to think about better and smarter policies. So some other obvious things, we know one of the best ways to get people out of poverty is to get land tenure reform. Actually, most of the world still live on agriculture. If you know you own your land, you're much more likely to do irrigation, you're much more likely to plant trees or high-value crops, and you're much more likely to be able to get a loan where you use your property as collateral. So this is the way out of poverty. We should make sure that every farmer knows that they own their land. They don't today. About 20–30% of all farmers believe that they're going to be evicted across the world in the next 5 years. That's a terrible outcome. There are many, many other things. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is probably the world's leading cause of death over the last 200 years. We estimate over the last 200 years, 1 billion people died from tuberculosis. 1 billion people. But we fixed that. Back in the 1930s, we found out how to fix tuberculosis because we got antibiotics. So now, none of you guys, no one in rich countries or in rich circumstances die from tuberculosis anymore. But there's still 1.25 million people that die needlessly every year. This is the world's leading infectious disease killer. It's more than HIV and malaria together. It's by far the world's biggest killer, except for the 2 years with COVID. And yet, nobody gives a damn. We know how to fix it. For about $5 billion a year, we could save 1 million people's lives. Why don't we do that? Again, if we know what works, we would be much more likely, I think, to spend money where it would really make a difference. So this is what we're doing together with Brazil, Minas Gerais, and many other places. We're trying to say what works, what doesn't. For instance, in education, don't spend money on tables, spend it on tablets, because this will make the difference between having no educational impact to having a huge educational impact. We know it with land tenure reform. We know it with a lot of other policies. Let's learn from everybody else. So one of the things I love about the vice governor in Minas Gerais, he says, I would love for everyone else to make mistakes for me, so I'll just learn from them and I don't have to do them myself. That is how we should all be thinking about problems, and that is what economics and cost-benefit analysis can help us with.
And that's true science, right?
Yes.
Yeah. The last question, because our time is running up. You were talking about the poverty and how poor people are more vulnerable. And we have here in Brazil another issue, which is sanitation. One of the poorer states where sanitation is very precarious is at Pará, where we're hosting COP30. So I think it's a little bit of hypocrisy where people don't have sanitation, which is also an environmental issue, super environmental issue, and you're hosting COP. So my question is, quick answer, how would you evaluate the cost-benefit relation of COP30?
Yeah, so there's a lot of people who pointed out, there's a reason why it's COP30, right? It's because there's been 29 other meetings. And what has been the net impact of that? It's very likely zero. Because remember, what happens is everyone will now come to Brazil in all their planes, and it's, I assume, very, very beautiful to go there. And then they will make lots of promises and they'll go home and not do them. That's what we've been doing for the last 30 years. Of course it's not going to solve the planet. And it is not going to be a solution as long as you rely on people to do something that is not beneficial for themselves. They will make these grand promises, then they'll go home and disavow them. And if they don't, of course, eventually they'll elect a Donald Trump instead. So the reality is we need to find a more sustainable way, if you want to use that word, and the way forward is innovation. It's always been innovation. Remember when, or don't remember, back in the 1860s, the world was basically relying on whale oil to keep it lit. Whale oil was what kept Western Europe and North America well lit, because whale oil burns really brightly. It also happens to be a really, really small part of the whale, and so we ended up almost hunting the whales to extinction. The solution was not to tell everyone, stop hunting the whales. Can you dim your lights in your houses? The solution was oil. We found a technological solutions. The same way with, in Los Angeles in the 1950s, it was terribly polluted, mostly because of cars. The solution was not to tell everyone, can you walk instead? The solution was a catalytic converter that basically made it possible to drive much further in a car and pollute much less. The solution has always been technological. That's the only way that we have fixed problems in the past, not by making everyone worse off, but by making better off with technology. So innovation is the path forward.
Thank you so much. I'll leave you 2 minutes to final considerations, but I would like to thank you for the lecture. It was reassuring to know that there are scientists, economists, and people, great minds, looking at the issue on such a grounded perspective. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a good stay in Brazil.
Thank you very much.